בשמחה ובצהלה, תוך אמוני עם סגולה, בואי חלה, בואי חלה.
You shall love Adonai with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. Take to heart these commandments I give you this day. Remember and tell all your children to live by my way. Speak of them when you're home, when you're on your way, when you lie down and get up and go about your day, as a sign on your hand and upon your head. On the side of your doorposts, my commandments may always be read. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Baruch Shekemo Malechuto Leolam Vaed. Please remember, observe all these words that I've said, to live and be holy for years straight ahead. For I am your God, out of Egypt I led. Be holy, be righteous, remember the words that I've said. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Baruch Shekemo Malechuto Leolam Vaed. You shall love Adonai with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. Take to heart these instructions I give you this day. Remember and tell all your children to live, oh, to live and remember my ways.
like you're fading away. Just call right out, we'll find a way. From a narrow place to a wide open space. From a narrow place to a wide open. From a narrow place to a wide open Green Habitar Karatia. Green Habitar Karatia. The door of our door for generations and generations, and the door of our door, our door, our door. The door of our door for generations and generations, and the door of our door, our door, our door. Look around the world, look around your town. Every single age is represented all around. You see them everywhere, every street, avenue or boulevard. Anywhere, any beach, any park or any yard. The door of our door for generations and generations, and the door of our door, our door, our door. Ecclesiastes said one generation goes and another generation arrives. He got it wrong. For years we all live side by side. Can you lean on those who arrived here before? Can you learn from those you remember being born? Can you see that we are all together evermore?
everyone. Let's try that again. Shalom l'kulam. L'chulam, thank you. Shalom l'chulam. I wanted to introduce you to my teacher, and some people say that sort of figurative, I don't know. Literally, in the most literal of senses, my teacher, Rabbi Garraway, who has kindly offered to come in and do the latest session in our series relating Torah to sort of the issues of the contemporary world and how we tackle them. Rabbi Garraway is a rabbi, also a PhD from Yale in the theology and early Christian texts, and a professor at the Hebrew Union College where I attend, and also a former member of this minyan before he went off to the wilds of Pasadena. And so, with that, I hand it to you.
Wonderful. So now I need to turn this on. Is that right? Okay, but people can hear me. This is working. Okay, wonderful. So thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here. And I will reiterate that we came here, I'd say, between 3 and 4 years, between maybe 08 and 011, 12, and we loved it. I mean, after we moved to Pasadena in 2010, we continued to come here on Saturday mornings because we enjoyed it so much. But then we sort of set up shop out in Pasadena, and we've been at the synagogue there for many years now. So, but it's wonderful to be back. I didn't know where to park because I always used to park under that building, which apparently is not there anymore. I kind of knew that because we have had some HUC events here. So I've been back, but I see a lot of familiar faces from 10 years ago, and it's wonderful to see. Everyone else has stayed the same age, but I'm somehow 10 years older. I don't know how that happened. This is the result of 3 children. It wasn't this color 10 years ago. It was a nice brown. It's still, memorialized in photographs. Okay, so I'm going to hand this out, which is the worksheet we're going to use. A teacher once told me never have more than 1 page. So it's 1 page with text on front and back, which should provide more than enough fodder for an hour and a half. I have nothing to do today because all Little League games just got canceled. So I'll be here till 3 in the afternoon if people want to talk. I don't really want to go home and watch my kids play TikTok all day. So Michael told me that, is it okay that I'm up here? Okay. I actually walk around HUC with my own stender. No matter what room I'm in, I refuse to speak without a lectern. So I just plop my lectern around and carry it around. It also has a 5th of whiskey inside, but the students don't know that. That's for faculty meetings. So I'm supposed to talk about a major contemporary issue, quickly correlated to the Parsha, and then moving on. Those were my instructions. So the major contemporary issue I want to talk about is an issue that a colleague and I raised in a conference that we held about 5 years ago here in Los Angeles, and then collected all of the essays, and then recently published a book with the essays from that conference. So the name of that conference was actually what became the name of the book. It was called These Truths We Hold, Judaism in an Age of Truthiness. So let me explain what that means. I'll tell you a little bit about the conference and the book, and then we'll delve into the contemporary topic, which is going to be, in fancy words, the epistemological crisis in the West. In simpler terms, why is it that people don't care about the truth anymore? So the presenting issue for the conference was the election of Trump in 2016, and then the inauguration, and a concern that was growing among many people on the more liberal side of politics, that there was now an administration that just brazenly lied about things that were going on in its campaign, things that were going on in the country, as well as a concern that this toleration for a lack of truth in the public forum was actually part and parcel of something that liberals themselves contributed to. And that is to say, especially liberals in the academy, who have embraced for 40 or 50 years a concept of postmodernity that suggests that truth is just a word, truth is just a perspective, and that there was a confluence of a sort of liberal intellectual approach to the world and what was now a more conservative political approach to the world that were challenging what many of us grew up on, which is the idea that it's a commitment to truth and reporting the truth and telling the truth that is the foundation of a progressive democratic society. And so we decided that we wanted to devote the money that we were given to hold a conference to this issue of truth as a contemporary issue. And as a title, we took These Truths We Hold, which is, of course, from the Declaration of Independence, the idea that there are certain things that are simply true that are the foundation of our democracy, that people have inherent rights and that government exists to protect those rights and so on. But then Judaism in an age of truthiness, that word truthiness, does anyone remember where it comes from? It comes from Stephen Colbert on, I think it was The Daily Show before there was a Colbert Report. And Stephen Colbert was this conservative personality. And he was talking about, the issue was weapons of mass destruction way back in 2005. And he coined this term, which is truthiness, which is where you're so committed to something being true that whether or not it's true, it's true. And that's what he called truthiness. And he had this funny line. He was like, you might say that the encyclopedia reports that the Panama Canal was built in 1904, but if I say 1941, then that's my right, or something like that. And that's how he introduced the term truthiness. And so we decided that we wanted to do a conference with a bunch of papers from really prominent scholars, because we were given a lot of money, on different Jewish approaches to truth over time. So truth in the Bible, truth in rabbinic literature, truth in medieval Jewish philosophy, truth in Jewish liturgical studies, how we pray, truth in practical life, truth telling. And then we also the crown jewel in our presenters was that we got the creators of the show in Israel called HaYehudim Ba'im. I don't know if you know this. It's a satirical show about Jewish history where all of the sketches are parodies of Jewish history. So I can tell you more of that if you want, but they came and they were a hit. And then, we collected all of the essays, and this volume came out last year. It's, the editors are me and my colleague in New York, Wendy Zierler, who's, I don't know if anyone's had a chance to study with her. She's about the smartest person you'll ever meet. So my topic for the day is going to be Judaism and its historical perspective on the truth. And what I'm going to try to propose is that you might be surprised what a traditional Jewish perspective on the truth is, because I certainly was. My expectation was that Judaism's approach to the truth, writ large, was going to be something more like what I find in, say, the ancient Greek world, where truth is upheld as not only a real thing, but an absolute value to which a person is beholden. And I think what we're going to find in the biblical and rabbinic texts that I'm going to show you, and then I can tell you about more texts that appear in the volume, is that that is very much not the Jewish approach to truth. So what is that approach, and what does this have to do with Parashat Ki Tisa? Well, you have to have the sheet to understand that. So I have 20, and it looks like, and I need one if that's okay. So there's 19 to be distributed. I think we should be okay. So while that's being passed around, let me just talk briefly about Ki Tisa, because we're only going to talk about one verse that's in Ki Tisa. It's probably the most important verse in the whole portion. But nonetheless, Ki Tisa's main events are what? The golden calf is the beginning in Exodus chapter 32. Moses comes down from the mountain, sees that the Israelites have engaged in orgiastic frenzy and built a calf. And Moses is upset, and he destroys the tablets, and then some people get killed. And then what happens in Exodus 33? Calf. Yeah. And not this kind of calf, the moo kind. Okay. What happens in 33? In 33, God and Moses have a little moment together. And eventually, Moses says, I want to see you, God. And God says, you can't see me and live. But if you hide behind that little a rock over there. I'll let you see my back. And then Exodus 34 starts. And God says, Moses, make 2 new tablets and come up and visit me. And Moses goes up alone to visit God. And God reveals God's self to Moses. And one of the ways God reveals God's self to Moses is saying, I'm Adonai, and here's what Adonai is like. And Adonai gives a sentence describing God's self. And it's a sentence I'm guessing you know, because it is said on the high holidays over and over and over and over. It sounds like Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'chanun, Erech Apayim b'rav chesed v'emet, Notzer chesed la'alafim, Nosei avon v'afesha, v'chata'a v'nakeh. And then you do it again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. Right? Now, why do we do that? Because here, God reveals God's characteristics. It says, Adonai passed before him, Moses, and said, Adonai, Adonai, a God who is Rachum v'chanun, compassionate and gracious, Erech apayim v'rav chesed ve'emet, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, Notzer chesed la'alafim, extending kindness to the 1000th generation, Nosei avon v'afesha v'chata'a, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Now, what you may not know, and which no one tells you on Yom Kippur when you're young, is that there's actually more to the verse that has been nixed, because there's a part of God that we don't want to think about on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and that's the part that says, nakeh lo yinakeh. So God does not remit all punishment, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children until the 3rd and 4th generation. That part is eliminated from the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur liturgy, because that's not a time that we want to think about God punishing our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren for our sins. Rather, the 13 attributes of God are the magnanimous attributes that appear in the first part of the sentence in our portion. The word I want to point to, obviously, if you were listening to the introduction, is that one of God's qualities here is described as emet. Rav chesed ve'emet. So that God is Rav chesed, full of great kindness. I'm not sure how you want to translate chesed. What did we put here? It does say kindness. And God is emet. So what does it mean to say that God is emet? Well, why don't I ask that before we look at some examples where I would suggest to you that God is not so emet, if you've looked below already. It's probably translated as faithfulness because the biblical root is aleph, med, and nun, which is where we get the word amen, meaning, you say something and I say amen, as in truth, brother, something like that. Like, yes, what you've said is true. But also leha'amin, the verb that means to believe that something is true. So amen and emet are actually related. Emet. Yeah, so what does it mean to say that God is true or truthful? Do you have a thought? Oh, well, don't be worried. What does it mean to say that God is true or God is truthful?
Well, maybe what it means is that God is the ultimate reality that none of us, including Moses, can clearly face.
And so what does it mean to say that God is the that God is the ultimate reality that Moses cannot face? So what is the relationship between ultimate reality and truth?
They are synonymous. That is, the truth is this ultimate reality that perhaps we can
Okay. So God is emet in the sense that God is, vouchsafes an ultimate reality that exists even if it can't necessarily be understood or ascertained by a person. Yeah. Emet is a noun. Well, maybe it's I mean, it's what, yes. So what does that mean? So everything, so one possibility is that God represents or stands for or secures an ultimate reality that is absolute and true. But another possibility is that what God says is always the truth or coincides with that ultimate reality, and therefore God's words can be trusted. If God says, I am Adonai your God, God is your God. If God says, don't kill people, then don't kill people is the right thing to do. So saying that God is emet means that what God says is reliable and true. Lovely. Can I use that as a segue into the next text? Because what I want to suggest to you is that that's not the case. There are actually cases in the Bible that not only you will recognize as examples where God either encourages people to lie or lies, but that the rabbis understood, that the ancient rabbis understood that at times God encourages people to lie or lies, and that there's actually something to be learned from that. And what we can learn from that actually tells us a lot about the way that Jews ought to think about truth. So let's look at the first example. This is a story that may be a little bit less familiar to you. The second one is probably more familiar to you. But what I've found is that many Jews don't know the narrative prophets, the stories of Saul and David and Solomon, as well as they know the stories about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So maybe I should give you a little bit of context. The Israelites leave Egypt. That we know about, right? Passover's coming up in 3 weeks. They travel through the wilderness. They meet God as a thunderstorm at a mountain. They get laws. They travel more and more and more. After 40 years, they cross the Jordan River and enter into Canaan. And they slaughter the residents of 31 cities and make it their land. That's the subject of the book of Joshua. And then in the next book, the Israelites have problems because they keep forgetting that God is their God and being naughty. So God keeps giving them temporary judges or charismatic leaders, like Deborah or Samson and Ehud, and they arise and they solve all of Israel's problems and they beat the Philistines and then they go away. And that's called the Judges cycle that's in the book of Judges. But then the next book is called 1 Samuel. Why is it called 1 Samuel? Because the very last of those judges is a guy named Samuel. And the people come to Samuel and they say, we're tired of this cycle of charismatic guys coming and ladies coming and ruling us. So we want a king. We want one guy that's going to be in charge, that can raise an army and mobilize our resources. Give us a king. And what does God say? Why? Why does he say no? I'm your king, you don't want a king. Kings are going to take your gold. They're going to make you serve in the army. They're going to take away your women. You don't want a king. They say, no, we want a king. So God gives them a king, and the king that God gives them is Saul. But Saul is an ill-fated king because Saul can't seem to do what God wants Saul to do. And the straw that broke the camel's back is actually a disturbing story where God says, hey, Saul, go kill the Amalekites over there. And after you've killed them, after you've defeated them, you need to slaughter everything in the community. Men, women, children, animals, everything you have to kill. And Saul goes and he destroys most of the things, but he keeps alive the king and he keeps alive some sheep because he wants to make some sacrifices to God. And there's a beautiful story, well, I don't know if it's beautiful, but I like the line, where Samuel comes walking up to the battlefield, and he's like, all right, Saul, did you do what God said? Did you annihilate everything in this community? And Saul says, I sure did. And what does Samuel say? He hears, bah, bah. Is that the bleating of sheep I hear? It's one of my favorite lines in the Bible. And Saul says, uh-oh. and God says, Saul's out. I need a new one. So apparently, God decides that down in Bethlehem, there's a guy named Jesse, and he has a bunch of sons. And one of those sons is going to be the next king. Turns out it's David. So he says to Samuel, hey, Samuel, I need you to go to Bethlehem, go to the house of Jesse, and I will point out which is going to be the next king. And if you know that story, like all these strapping young bucks come forward, and Samuel's like, that must be the next king, and God's like, nope, not that one, and it turns out it's like the scrawny little redhead out in the field, and that's David. But before we get to that story, remember, God says to Samuel, Saul's out, I hate Saul. Go to Jesse's house and find the next king. So what happens? God says to Samuel, how long are you going to mourn over the fact that Saul's a bad king? I have spurned his kingship over Israel. Now, fill your horn with oil. Why would he fill his horn with oil? To go find a new king? Yes, because he's going to anoint him on the head and make him anointed Mashiach. Right? He's going to make him Messiah by putting oil on his head. I was riding up Robertson. Apparently, Messiah is here. I teach a freshman seminar at USC on the history of the Messianic idea. That picture is, I took a picture on Shabbos, I apologize, but that's going right into a lecture. Because when they find out that Messiah is here and living in Beverlywood, they're going to be astonished. And it doesn't look like any of the Messiahs we've studied either. He's kind of, okay. So take your oil and go to Jesse's house, and I'll let you know which one is the king. Because I have found among his sons a king for me. But Samuel says, rightfully, well, how can I go do that? If Saul hears that I'm walking around with a horn of oil, ready to spread it on the next king of Israel, he's going to kill me. So what does God say? Take a heifer with you. And you just say, oh, I'm here to make a sacrifice, not to anoint a new king of Israel. And say, I'm going to have a sacrifice. Jesse, come to my sacrifice party, and then we'll find the king. In other words, it's a lie. It's a subterfuge. God tells Samuel to lie. Now, some people might find that upsetting, but if they find that only a little bit upsetting, that God would encourage another person to lie, what about the next passage in which God just outright lies? So this is the passage where God has come to visit Abraham in like kind of three different beings that are one being. This is, in medieval polemics, this is like the Christian's ace in the hole. I assure you, I've read a lot of these medieval polemics, and Christians like, what do you mean God can't be three and one at the same time? Have you read Genesis 18? So we're not going to get into that today, but what happens is that this three people, one people thing says to Abraham, you're going to have a kid. And Sarah doesn't believe it. So what does that look like? The angel, the three in one thing, says to Avraham, I'm going to return to you in due time, and your wife Sarah is going to have a son. So don't fret that all you have is Ishmael. You're going to have a son through Sarah. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years, and Sarah was no longer fertile. I think she was 90. Sarah laughed to herself. Presumably she was eavesdropping. And she said, now that I am withered, shall I have pleasure? And my husband is no spring chicken either. That's a loose translation that I came up with yesterday in a lot of caffeine. But that's what she says. My husband is no spring chicken. How is he? You can't make a baby as a man at 100 or a woman at 90. Then God said to Abraham, so God says, I'm going to go talk to Abraham about his wife's lack of faith. Why did Sarah laugh, saying, will I indeed bear a child, old as I am? But that's not what Sarah said. Sarah said the problem is that Abraham is no spring chicken. But God goes to Abraham and says, yeah, your wife complained and said that she's too old to have a baby. So God lies about what was said. Now, you might say God didn't lie. This is just reporting something that God heard that isn't mentioned previously. There's lots of ways that you could try to get around this and say, well, God didn't really lie. But on the surface, at least, the Peshat reading is God heard one thing from Sarah and reported it differently to Abraham. To me, that's misrepresenting the truth. That's lying. Does that disturb anyone? Well, would this be omission or commission? Because even though, well, it could be both. Well, how would it be a lie of omission? Right, and in what way is it a lie of commission? Well, it's not it's only in the sense that God does slightly change the words, because what says in here, Sarah says, now I'm withered, shall I have pleasure? She doesn't say, I am old. Well, I mean, that seems to be her assumption. Although she doesn't know, by the way, if there's a great midrash, how God takes away all of her wrinkles. Like in a moment's notice, there's no visit to a doctor. She just, all of a sudden, she's not wrinkly. She did something. Apparently, she also went to the best God, the plastic surgeon. It's a wonderful midrash. Abraham loses his wrinkles too. Everyone's just young and sprightly when God comes to visit. Yeah. Well, let's do Marcy first, and then we'll come here. So that's an apologetic approach. So a lot of medievals would say something like that. Either God's not lying, or if it appears that God's lying, you're not reading it correctly, because God, by definition, can't lie. That would be something Maimonides would say.
And I'm very much like
Yeah. No, and that's very consistent with the kind of Greek way of looking at the world that Maimonides was influenced by, where there is absolutism. And has anyone seen is it called The Good Place? So The Good Place was this show written, I'm guessing, by a Jewish guy who took a lot of moral philosophy in college. And so he writes this beautiful show about sort of what heaven and hell are like. And in heaven/hell, there's this character who's this moral philosophy professor. And he's just religiously won't lie. To him, it's an absolute that you have to do and say everything that is consistent with the truth. And that's a Greek philosophical position, which if you maintain, you have to say that God here is either not lying or you don't understand the full truth of it. What I'm going to suggest, based on the next passage we'll look at now, is that it's not that God is or is not emet. The issue is that when God describes God's self, God says that God is Rav Chesed V'emet. God is abundant in kindness and truth. And sometimes you cannot be truthful and kind, or kind and truthful. And so what we're going to see, and I'm going to try to set up, is that the way the rabbis think about truth is that it is not an absolute standard. It is a virtue to be embraced and pursued, but one of many virtues that compete with one another. And in fact, we're going to see it may be actually one of the lower of the highest virtues, lower than, say, peace, shalom, or chesed, or tzedek. Exalted, but maybe not the most exalted, because God is Rav Chesed and emet. Sometimes God needs to misrepresent the truth. So you can see that in this passage from the Gemara, which is from Bavli Yevamot. So if you see that B, that means the Babylonian Talmud, the tractate Yevamot, which is about what? Rabbinical students can't answer.
When someone is a widow and they have to marry the
levirate marriage, right? So if a man gets married and dies before he has children, then the brother has to come in and marry the woman in order to produce children for his older brother. It's an old-fashioned custom. There's an entire tractate about it in the Talmud. Now you might be saying, what does that have to do with the subject matter here? Lesson 1 in the Gemara. 6 times out of 10, what you're reading about in the Gemara actually has nothing to do with the tractate that lends its name to, the name that lends itself to the tractate. So this has nothing to do with levirate marriage, but here we go. Rabbi Elia said, in the name of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Shimon, doesn't matter who it is, it is permissible, mutar, for a person to alter words, lishanot, to alter words in a matter of shalom. In other words, if preserving peace is the desideratum, you can lie. You can change words. You can misrepresent what was said. How do I know that? As it is said, your father commanded before his death, thus you shall say to Joseph, please forgive the wrongdoing. Now that's a story we didn't look at, but it's not a story that's, I think, foreign to many of us. You know, in the very last chapter of Genesis, all of the Joseph story has played out, and now Jacob has died. And when the brothers see that Jacob has died, they say, there's a good chance that Joseph was only nice to us because Dad was still alive. Now that Dad's dead, what if he comes for revenge because of what we did to him? So they go to Joseph and they say, hey, Joseph, right before Dad died, he said, forgive your brothers. This is like Johnny Skiki, if people know that opera, where like right before someone dies, you sort of mess up their will and then you're not in trouble after they die. It's deception. Okay, and they're saying the Torah would only report that if it was allowable. Brothers of Joseph, how could they lie? This isn't the best argument. The next two are much better. But the argument is that Joseph's brothers lied, so God must be condoning it. Now, why did they lie? They lied for the sake of bringing shalom between the brothers and Joseph. Did you have a question? You're wearing a cast, so it's hard to tell if you're... Okay. My best friend, when we were 10, he went to play football with the big kids, tackle, and he compound fractured his arm. So for 6 months, my best friend was walking around like this. And the best was when I slept over at his house, and I looked over and he was in his bed, and I just saw this arm popping up, and I thought, oh my gosh, he has to sleep like that every night for 6 months. He had a little too much aggression. But they go on. They say, that's not the best verse. Not only is it mutar, not only are you allowed to manipulate the words of another if it is for the sake of shalom, it is a mitzvah, says the next rabbi. Rabbi Nathan says it is a mitzvah to do that. How do I know that? Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me. So in that case, not only was Samuel allowed to lie about bringing a sacrifice, it was actually a commandment for him to do so. And then it goes on. It was taught in the school of Rabbi Ishmael. I think it's Rav Shalom. Great is peace. After all, even God alters the words of others, as it is written, again, a passage you've seen, and my husband is no spring chicken, but at the end is written, old as I am. So God manipulates speech, God's self, which clearly demonstrates that it is not only mutar, permissible to do so, it is actually a commandment. So what the rabbis are saying here is that shalom, and you're going to see later, chesed and tzedek, are of such high value that they often trump emet when it comes at least to reporting other people's words or what happened. Questions? You seem very disturbed. I meant about what I'm teaching, not generally speaking. Sorry, that was not a...
I think we call it alternative facts.
Yeah, so we're going to talk at the end about alternative facts, because what I want to do is destabilize the notion of the truth for you and let you see that, wow, Judaism actually says that sometimes lying or fibbing or misrepresenting the truth or even not caring about the truth, sometimes that's okay. And then I want to take that all the way and say, well, does that mean that it's perfectly fine to go on the news and say, yeah, there were 300,000 people at my rally when there were 11? And I'm going to say no. But the question we want to ask is, well, why? Like, what is it that the rabbis are saying about the truth? If they're not viewing it as an absolute standard, well, why is it still worthwhile? How are we going to get there? So we'll get there at the end. But first, yeah. That's what we're going to ask at the end. I mean, certainly it's not an unreasonable question in light of what you see in the Talmud. The question is going to be, how do you determine what a devar shalom is? That seems to have opened up a can of worms, and we still got a great midrash coming. Let's take 4 comments, 5. We'll go 1, 2, and then 3, 4, 5. Go ahead. That may well be true. I'm not here, by the way, to tell you the way we should structure society. I'm just trying to give you a Jewish perspective that might be different from what you would have thought going in. Oh, do you want me to repeat what's said? Oh. Why don't you, can you just, because I'll eventually stumble and then. Say it again? Scott. Oh, it was someone over here. Oh. Yeah, someone wanted to say something back here, and then there was a line here. Okay, we will go to Lynn.
So just the idea of Judaism and truth. I'm an alum of Brandeis University. Its logo includes the Hebrew word emet, and the logo has the word truth into its innermost parts. So it's just interesting how many parts there are to Jewish truth.
Absolutely. And what is the motto of Harvard? Veritas, which means truth. And what is the motto of Yale? Because Yale's better than Harvard. Lux et veritas, light and truth. And what is the Hebrew, though, on that logo? Urim v'tumim, which is the priestly
2 stones
stuff.
on the.
But because Urim and Tumim looks like or-im, like light, and Tumim, like the Tom sun, the kind of the simple, pure, truthful. So it's all just a big mistranslation. But anyway, yes, no, I mean, universities ground themselves on being committed to the truth and the kind of absolute Greek standard. We're doing Cheva and then Marcy, and then I don't know your name. Say it one. Fala. Farah. Okay. From Iran. Wonderful.
So I'm actually a little concerned about the Genesis 18 text as a proof text for the rabbinic argument here, because it doesn't seem to me that God is pursuing peace, or if God is pursuing peace in this moment of lying, between whom? It seems like the peace being pursued is only between God and Abraham, because God is lying to Abraham about what his wife said and saying, like, hey, she's a problem, which seems like it would create less shalom bayit instead of more.
So there is a full midrash on Genesis 18 in Bava Metzia 80-something, where it goes into a little bit more detail. And it says that the shalom here is between Abraham and Sarah, because God is afraid that if Abraham learns that Sarah said that he's old, that he's going to feel bad. And then there is going to be a breach in their relationship. So he doesn't say to him that she made fun of him. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me, because my wife and I constantly rib each other back and forth about how old we're getting, and I think that's what most old couples do, because otherwise you probably wouldn't stay together very long. So I don't think it was a secret to Abraham or Sarah that they were old, and they probably kid each other, but That's at least the way it's read in the Gemara. Marcy.
Oh, thank you. So I think there's a difference in truth in interpersonal relationships and truth in the public square. So if you're in a relationship with somebody, your best friend says, "Do you think I'm starting to look old?" You might say, "No, you look great. You haven't aged a bit." To yourself, you're thinking, "Yeah, you're really getting old looking." But you don't say that because you're trying to keep peace. Now, are you lying? Yeah. But is it being kind? Yeah. So to me, that's okay. Now, the lying that's going on in news or whatever, that's different. So I think there's a separation, and I think that's what we're trying to get to. When is it permissible to lie, and when is it not? And that's what's gotten so fuzzy, and we can't distinguish anymore between the two.
Yeah, so I mean, one way to think about it, before we get to Farah, is the way my colleague Wendy would describe it is that if the purpose of misrepresenting the truth is for your own benefit or your own self-aggrandizement, that's not chesed. So if a person says a lie about themselves or brags about the size of the crowd that came to their ceremony, right, that's not for the benefit or the chesed of anybody else. I mean, that's for your own. But in these are cases where God is not benefiting at all from misrepresenting the truth or from preserving the life of Samuel. That is all for the benefit of someone else, and that is what chesed and shalom are ultimately about. Does that prevent entirely the concern over destabilization? I'm not sure it does, but it's at least one way to go about thinking about how you deal with truth when it's no longer an absolute standard, but a competing virtue among others. And we'll look at a couple more texts that raise that question on the back. But first, we need to hear from Farah from Iran.
Yes. You know, I read a lot of books regarding these things in the Farsi, but I think you are talking about one Iranian person that was not against the Jewish, but wrote a book and bring everything from the Torah. And it is something for laugh, for fun, that Iranian was reading that God says this, why it is like that. And I think you are the same way. I'm sorry to tell that one. I am not religion person, but I think anyway, we are as a Jewish to have some faith, at least to the God. A lot of things that I know regarding like Cyrus the Great, that they say that in his Torah is not correct. Why he went make the Jewish freedom? Because Jewish sent a spy to him and say, "Come to Ashur and we help you."
Yeah.
And they showed him the way that he goes and then make the Jewish free. Or that Esther and Mordechai, I'm from Hamadan, I know is not such a thing like Esther and Mordechai. It was a Arzestarian queen that was Shushandocht. And the Zartoshti, the Assyrian, was afraid that her son will be the king, and king will be Jewish. So they decide to destroy them. And then Arabs attacked to Iran. So this mother and son ran away. They ran to Hamadan and then killed over there, and there is their place. That's such a thing like Esther and Mordechai. A lot of things in that book, it shows that is lie. I wrote that book. So,
Yeah, so
I think you are the same way.
First of all, people here will know that my family at least admires Cyrus very much, and we named our firstborn son after Cyrus the Great. What you're raising is an interesting question that we actually address in the first couple of chapters in the book, particularly the first one, where we have an article from Mark Brettler, who is, I would say, at the top of the dean of Hebrew Bible scholars today. And he addresses the problem of scripture lying. And so he talks about the problem of Deuteronomy representing the language of Exodus, or First Chronicles representing the language of First and Second Samuel. And you could raise this with Esther or lots of other biblical books. And I mean, he asks the question: are biblical authors that are rewriting previous biblical passages lying, or are they simply, like we might say, claiming that they have ascertained a better understanding of the truth and therefore revising in accordance with what they know to be true? And it's a wonderful piece, and Mark's a smart guy. You want to hear a fun story about Iran? It takes 1 minute, but it's a gem. I don't know if it's true, but I think it is. Our emeritus rabbi in Pasadena, his name is Gil Collin. Do you know Gil? Okay, he told this story, I've heard him say it 3 times, that in 1980, there was a Persian community that had come to Pasadena and was in the synagogue. And they had left in the middle of the night and had left their Torah in their synagogue. And they wrote letters back to Iran every week. We left our Torah, we left in a hurry, could you please send the Torah? We don't want anything else, just please send the Torah. 6 months, 9 months, a year, kept writing these letters. And then one day, Rabbi Collins says he got a call from the port of Los Angeles. A ship just came in. There's a crate that says, to the Jews of Pasadena, do not open on pain of death unless you are a Jew of Pasadena, signed the Ayatollah Khomeini, or something like that. And he drove down to the port of Los Angeles, and now we have a Persian Torah in a beautiful silver case that we read from on the high holidays. I suspect the story is embellished a little bit, but it's a good one. Okay. Yeah, last question, then we're going to switch, and it's Perry, right?
So this shalom bayit, is a phrase that's, to keep the peace at home. With any of these things, how far can you go when it comes to having to break a mitzvah? Is there a line?
Well, break a mitzvah would be a different question. It depends what you mean by break a mitzvah, I guess.
Well,
and you can't. I don't know if you can break a mitzvah. Tell me what you mean.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if it means that you have to, if there's something you're not supposed to do and then you end up having to do it. I really don't know. I know that when my uncle died, the rabbi, very, very religious rabbi, told my father he shouldn't sit Shiva so my grandmother wouldn't know that her son had died.
Oh, well,
and
that
Shiva
I
is
don't-
not that's not a regular mitzvah, but what I'm trying to say, where
That is the sort of thing I'm guessing the rabbis would not condone. That ultimately, what they're talking about here is, reporting language, reporting events in a way that misrepresents what's real. If it actually came to certainly violating a negative commandment, I doubt it would be condoned. And they might suggest some, in the interest of chesed, some alternative way of observing the positive commandment, but would probably not brook the possibility of just ignoring the positive commandment.
When was your conference?
18? Yeah, is it Stephen Wise?
I brought you.
Not to mention a competitor, I apologize.
So, you got me thinking about ratings.
I understand, well, for now.
You got me thinking about the ratings of God's characteristics, because when he was, obviously when Moses went up on Sinai and God saw what the people were doing, he gave him the following expression: Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'Chanun, Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed, the Emet. And Emet was so far down the list of God's characteristics that perhaps it's, as you're saying, it's not that important in certain ways.
And I did not pay Perry to say that, but that is a perfect segue to the midrash that is on the back of the page from Genesis Rabbah that actually, in some ways, prioritizes these virtues. Now, it's a very complicated midrash. I've looked at it probably 30 times, and I'm still not sure exactly the way I want to read it. So you're going to help me. And this is a midrash that deals with the moment of creation, the creation of the human being on the sixth day, where God has created light and dark and dry land and plants and platypuses and all this stuff. And now God is thinking, am I going to add to the mix the Adam, the first human being? And so Rabbi Simon says, that's kind of funny. Okay, because Simon Says is a game that kids play. By the way, 10 years ago, I didn't have to take off my glasses to read. Yeah, that happened. Rabbi Simon said, when God came to create the first human, the ministering angels formed themselves into factions. There was a debate in heaven. Some said Adam should not be created. Others said Adam should be created. How do we know this? Well, this is the way Midrash works. It finds a verse somewhere else in the Tanakh that it reads as describing another moment in Tanakh. So it says, in Psalm 85:11, it says, kindness and truth met, justice and peace kissed. Now, you have to know here that the word for kiss, neshek, is very much related to the word for weapon or armament. And so I think what they're reading here is that the psalm is saying that there was a moment where kindness and truth came together and justice and peace clashed. And that was at the moment when God was deciding whether or not to create the Adam. Kindness said, and kindness here is chesed. Chesed said, so chesed is capitalized because this is the angel that represents chesed. Chesed said, Adam should be created because Adam will do gemilut chasadim. Adam will do acts of kindness. Adam will donate to charity, help little old men cross the road, and whatever it is that you consider gemilut chasadim. Adam is going to do those, so let's create him. But truth said, Adam should not be created because he is full of lies. You don't have to live very long to realize people lie all the time. Judge Judy, whom I like a lot, some of you probably know her, one of my favorite things she says is whenever teenagers are on the show, the teenager will show up with the parent, and Judge Judy says to the parent, you know how I know that kid's lying? Because he's moving his lips. Her assumption is that teenagers just lie incorrigibly, which may be true. I don't know. Our oldest is 14, so we're just starting to experience that. But, I mean, people lie right and left. The rabbis were not stupid. They said, look, truth got up there and said, yeah, don't create a human being. He's just going to lie all day long. Okay. Justice said, this is tzedek, Adam should be created because Adam will do just acts. I don't think anyone disputes that. But Shalom said Adam should not be created because Adam is full of quarrels. And if you teach Jewish history, Tanakh to Palmach, which I do at USC, 3,000 years of history, you see that humanity is indeed full of quarrels because history is just one war preceded by the next. And so Shalom has a point here. Okay. Well, now we get to the climax of the story because God has to decide what to do. What does God do? God took truth and threw truth to the ground and said, as it says in Daniel chapter 8, truth was thrown to the ground. Now, this is a hilarious proof text if you know Daniel chapter 8. I'll explain it in a moment. But God threw truth to the ground. The ministering angels said before the Blessed One, holy be God, oh, Master of the universe, why are you disgracing your seal? Now, the word seal here is a completely messed up word in the manuscript that tried to use a Greek loanword and didn't know what it meant and then redoubled it, and no one really knows what this word is. But Rashi says it's the word seal because elsewhere God says that truth is God's seal. So saying, God, why did you take your seal, the thing that you used to sign documents, and you threw it to the ground. And they say, bring truth back from the ground, resurrect truth. And that's why the next line in the psalm, after kindness and truth met, justice and peace kissed, truth will grow from the ground. Because God, in creating the human being, started by throwing truth to the ground. Now let me tell you what's funny about this intertext, because it may well affect your interpretation of this midrash. Truth was thrown to the ground in the book of Daniel. Does anyone know what the book of Daniel is about? The answer is Daniel. Okay, the first 6 chapters are about Daniel. Don't worry about him. What's fun about Daniel is the last 6 chapters. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 6 chapters. The last 6 chapters of Daniel are about a holiday that you all know and love because you get presents and eat greasy food. Hanukkah! So really, there's a biblical book about Hanukkah? There is a biblical book about Hanukkah. You never knew that. In 167, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid king of Syria, advanced a series of decrees saying that in Jerusalem you couldn't read Torah anymore, and we're going to sacrifice pigs on the altar, all this stuff. People know that, right? And who saved the day? The Maccabees, because what did they do? They went out into the wilderness, formed an army, and kicked some butt. Okay, so when I teach this, I explain, yes, one reaction to Antiochus IV Epiphanes were the Jews who went out and formed an army and kicked some butt. But then I point out, many Jews, you may know, are nerds. They don't join the army. They study. I taught this once, and someone raised their hand and said, I don't think some Jews are nerds. I think all Jews are nerds. But what did the nerdy Jews do? They went down into a basement and wrote a story. They wrote it in code. They said, oh my goodness, this event with Antiochus IV Epiphanes means that the world's about to end. Because God is about to intervene in history and send God's the special angel, Michael, that's going to save us all and destroy the Greeks and then raise the dead and judge the world. All of this is going to happen any minute now. And wrote it in code. And that's what Daniel's chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are all about. I promise you. And when it says here in chapter 8, and truth was thrown to the ground, this is actually describing Antiochus IV Epiphanes and his campaign against Jerusalem, as if he grabbed truth and threw it to the ground. So here, God is actually being compared with the character of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who is referred to as like the third horn from the goat, and the goat is Alexander the Great. It's all written in code, but the code is quite clear. But I don't know what to make of that. The rabbis knew exactly what this passage from Daniel 8 is, and yet they're comparing God to perhaps, in the rogues gallery of horrible historical figures towards Jews, Antiochus IV Epiphanes is on the Mount Rushmore. Lynn, so it's open season now. What does this mean?
Well, the first thing I thought of when I read that line, truth will grow from the ground, is the tree in the Garden of Eden, the knowledge of good and evil. And, that eventually led to the downfall of humanity because Eve ate of the fruit. But was it the truth?
I don't know. I mean, I've taught this many times, and no one has ever said, truth was thrown to the ground and became the seedling for either the tree of life or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's intriguing. Yeah?
Could this be the basis for the sort of idea of lo b'shamayim he?
The next one is yes. Yes, and especially the next passage, which is the very definition of lo b'shamayim he, which I'll explain.
Which is, okay.
Yeah.
I'll skip that.
I don't know your name.
Victor.
Victor. That's
Yeah,
a nice
so-
Latin name. I like it.
Very Greek. Maybe this is explaining why God created the universe, not just humanity. That is, if God wanted everything to be perfectly true and there to be no evil, then there was no need to create the universe, much less human beings. But so God decides nonetheless to create a universe and to create human beings, and with full knowledge that there will be evil, there will be less than truth, but that there is some process that will be generated from this creation that, as the rabbis would say, ultimately the good guys win. Ultimately,
And that's represented by the growth,
truth
like a Jack
grows.
Beanstalk that will
Right.
eventually reach heaven.
That creation eventually will achieve something that God had, intended all along. God knows what
Right.
the story is. We don't, but that's.
Which, by the way, is very much in line with the way the founders of the Reform movement in the 19th century described Reform Judaism. That there had been history, and history had been a constant building up of truth and knowledge. And they said, now we know about science and democracy and all of these things, and biblical criticism and historical awareness, and therefore we're right at the end of history. And
They had never attended a board meeting. That's why they.
Well, they also weren't aware that Germans weren't on the same page as them, and it's very difficult to read that stuff. But they speak in purely messianic language, all about that truth has reached. We've reached the end of the quest for human truth, and we're finally at the precipice, or whatever the threshold. Yeah.
This is a statement couched as a question, couched as a conundrum. And you mentioned your kids going home to play TikTok, which is such a dad way of talking about TikTok. You and I both teach at the same university, and there's a problem that we're having right now that draws off of what Marcy was saying about the individual versus the collective, or the private versus the public. And my students who are in the film school are tired of people saying, find your passion and do it, because a lot of them don't have passion, right?
I'll tell you a story about that.
Right? And the same thing's true about what I grew up with, which is find your truth. What is my truth, and how does it relate to your truth and everybody else's truth? And we're in such an individualistic stage with the internet right now, where your kids are finding their truth on TikTok, which might be only for them because theirs is completely different than their siblings. And there's the individual versus the collective, which may be the public, I don't know. But this is problematic in that we now are allowed to be completely individual as opposed to dealing with the collective. And I find this to be much more about, okay, well, if God is the collective and God's throwing truth back to the ground, then we're all individually finding our own truth around the ground, looking around, looking for our truth. And that's where everything falls apart, where there's no collective truth.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why I said at the beginning that Wendy and I were both aware that there was a measure of, in our opinion, intellectual liberal complicity in the current truth crisis. I was trained by a postmodern Marxist in ancient history. I mean, I was taught that his motto was de omnibus dubitandum. Everything is to be doubted, right? Because there is no grand master narrative. There is no absolute truth. Words are always limited in what they can capture, and truth is created by the discourse and all of this stuff. And, I broke my teeth on that stuff. And that is part and parcel of the more grand political lying that we are also now, I think, subjected to. And I don't know if there's going to be some kind of epistemic shift, or maybe we're just overrating it. I'm not really sure. Just a quick story about passion. You know that passion comes from the Latin passio, which means to suffer. That's why it's the passion of Christ, because it's Christ's story of suffering. So every once in a while, do you ever get invited to sorority houses for the academic dinner? Oh, so I've been to one fraternity house, but then it got closed down. But I often go to these sorority academic dinners.
That got closed down.
Oh, and they asked one time, they're like, oh, can you just get up and say a couple words about, it's just, they have these dinners and you're an invited professor. And so every professor before me was like, oh, just pursue your passion, pursue your passion, pursue your passion. And I said, all right, ladies, are you aware that passio means suffering? So are you willing to suffer for a year, 3 years, 5 years in order to get what you want? Because if not, you should really stop talking about your passion. Because passion doesn't doesn't mean I really like something. It means I'm willing to suffer for a very long period of time in order. All right, last comment, then I want to move on to what I think you'll find an even more disturbing claim by the rabbis, and that we can spin that off into a discussion about all of this stuff. Yeah.
I mean, an alternative look at truth is that it's phenomenological. In other words, it's based on what you observe, and different observers will see different things in it. It's the Rashomon story of everyone seeing the same event, but everyone from a somewhat different perspective that they brought to it or from their observation point.
Mm-hmm. So, by the way, there's a wonderful article in this book by my colleague, a professor in Jerusalem, Michael Marmer, which he calls, so we had him and a fellow you may know, Mark Diamond, who was the former chief, board of rabbis, whatever, the leader of the board of rabbis, and they both talked about truth as a problem in interfaith relations. And Mark wrote about his experiences at Loyola Marymount, and Michael wrote an article he called Diagonal Pluralism. And he said there's two ways that people talk about pluralism. One is horizontal pluralism, which is Rashomon, where we say, four people who are totally different, a poet, a philosopher, a scientist, and a historian, God forbid. They all watch an event, and then they describe it, but they describe it differently because they're four different kinds of people. So you could imagine that being Christian, Muslim, Jew, but whatever. And then he said there's something called vertical pluralism, which is where you actually take four different poets who are all theoretically seeing the world poetically, and yet they describe an event in four different ways. That's what he calls vertical pluralism, and he says that the aspiration is to find something he calls diagonal pluralism. Honestly, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but if you want to read that article, I mean, it's trying to mix those two. But yeah, no, that's absolutely right, although that's, I think, different than what, at least in the biblical passage, is being described here, where there's a clear attempt to manipulate the truth, not just offer an alternative perspective. I would just say a couple things about this midrash that I've thought about. One is the way that chesed, tzedek, and shalom seem to be described as the absolute virtues. Those are the ones that should not be compromised, really, in any case. Maybe that's what it's saying, whereas truth is the one that is subjected to tzedek, chesed, and shalom. It's still an angel. I mean, it's still one of the great virtues, but it's the one that is subordinate to those three grand virtues. And another way I've thought about it, based on an article that's in the book by Jeff Middleman. Have you had Jeff Middleman here? Jeff Middleman is a rabbi who runs an institute in New York called Sinai and Synapses. And what he's trying to do is allow Jews, who tend to be, in many cases, very smart and often very well trained in the sciences, to allow Jewish science and Jewish scientists to have a conversation with Jewish tradition. And so you can get a grant from his organization. I don't know, you get like 10 grand and you can do lectures. Our synagogue just got it because we have all these Caltech people and they're really into science. And so he wrote an article about, well, one way of knowing the truth is science. Like that, and we use that all the time now. It's almost laughable the way people, well, I do this because that's what the science says. And Jeff just rips that to shreds. He's like, that's not the way scientists talk. No scientist worth her salt would ever say, well, because, we've had 2 years of experiments, now we know that this is the truth. They would say, yeah, maybe it's provisionally the truth, because the scientist always sees truth as sort of a growing organic entity that changes directions and sometimes it goes back. And there's a notion among scientists that we're ultimately getting somewhere. But we're getting somewhere by two processes. One process that is circuitous. We're wrong, then we're right, then we're wrong twice, then we're right, but eventually we're going in the right direction. But also, the way he describes, he'd say, scientists won't describe it as a progress of truth or a progress of knowing. They would say that it's a progress that's based on the exposure of falsehood. In other words, we're becoming increasingly less beclouded. That's the process of science. Now, maybe that's just semantics, but when I think about that growing truth that's heading towards the heavens, I often think that's the way scientists describe our constant unbeclouding of ourselves. I want to do one more text that I hope you will find disturbing. Because most people don't get upset if we say, oh, shalom is such a value that it trumps truth, or chesed, or tzedek. Of course. What about political authority? Anybody that comes, by the way, this is interesting when we're talking about horizontal pluralism, because a person that grew up in a stable 200-year democracy like America, which I was lucky to do, is going to hear this and see this probably very differently than a person who grew up in a tyrannical state. Yeah, that's important. Someone said, oh, well, is this the lo b'shamayim hi? Lo b'shamayim hi is in Deuteronomy, but I assume it's a reference to one of the most famous passages in the Talmud, which we're not going to look at. But we're going to look at a better version of it because it's legal. So that's the story where Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and Rabbi Joshua are arguing over whether a certain oven is kosher. It doesn't matter what the sides are. So let's say that Eliezer says that it's not kosher. And Rabbi Joshua, with all of the army of rabbis behind him, says, yeah, it's kosher. And Eliezer says, I'm telling you it's not kosher. I'm so confident I'm right that if I'm right, that river over there that's flowing this way is going to flow backwards. And sure enough, it flows the other way, indicating God thinks I'm right. And it goes on, and Joshua says, yeah, we don't care, because it doesn't matter if miracles have, that's not how we determine the truth. And then Rabbi Eliezer says, yeah, if I'm right, that tree is going to get uprooted and move 100 feet. And it does. And Rabbi Joshua and his rabbis say, yeah, it doesn't matter. You can work as many miracles as you want. And the story goes on, and eventually a voice comes down from the heavens and says, everybody, Rabbi Eliezer is correct. And what does Rabbi Joshua say? Lo b'shamayim hi. The truth about this halachic decision is not in heaven. It's ours to determine. And the rabbis in the majority say the oven is kosher. It's kosher. Now, there's an even better rendering of that dynamic, I think, in this passage, which comes from Mishnah Rosh Hashanah, where the rabbis basically say, astronomy be damned. It doesn't matter. The way we determine that a new month occurred is that the court says a new month has occurred. Even when it's patently wrong, it doesn't matter. So, it's a story of Rabban Gamliel, who was the leader of the Sanhedrin at Yavna, and he had the phases of the moon on a tablet on the wall of his attic. Why? Because, well, maybe I need to take a step back here. How is the new moon, a new month, determined in rabbinic times? Do people know? Good, so people would look up and they're like, okay, the month is now 28 days old, so is it going to be a 29-day month or a 30-day month? Well, we all have to watch the sky, and as soon as we see a new moon, right, we see the moon completely concealed, it's no longer a waning crescent, then we run to the court and we say, we saw it, we saw it, we saw it, and a new month starts. And there's all kinds of laws about witnesses, and you can't be a gambler or a woman, or these kinds of things. Okay, so Rabban Gamliel had the phases of the moon on a placard in his attic. Why? Because he would show the potential witnesses. You'd come and say, all right, I think I saw it. And he'd say, well, did you see something that looks like this? Or did you see something? It's almost like a doctor, like looking at your rash. It's like, did you see this? Or did you see this? Which one did you see? And once 2 men came and said, we saw it in the morning in the east. Presumably, we saw the waning crescent this morning in the east, and then this evening we saw the new moon in the west. Now, I don't know about how moons appear in the world, except that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, yeah, these are false witnesses. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, we all know that if this is the way you see the moon, you're lying because you can't see the moon that way. Waning crescent in one and then a new moon or something like that. Don't get caught up in the astronomy. It doesn't matter for the purpose of the story. Yet when they came to Yavna, Rabban Gamliel accepted their testimony. Now a more problematic one. Another time, two men came and said, we saw the new moon when we thought we were going to see it, right? Let's say on the 29th day. So it was going to be a new month. But the next night, which was going to be, which turns out to be it's hard to, there's a pun here going on the word ubar, which means pregnant. I'll explain it in a moment. The next night of the full month, it wasn't visible. In other words, one night we saw a new moon, and the next night we saw a waning crescent. Rabbi Dosa ben Hyrcanus said, these are false witnesses. How can one testify that a woman has given birth, and then the next day her belly is still pregnant? It actually says her belly is between her teeth, which is a weird expression. But there's a pun here that you may know that a Jewish month is either 29 or 30 days. And it's 29 if it's regular, because the moon cycle is 29 and a quarter days, or 29 and a half? 29 and a half. Okay, so if a month has 30 days, it's called a pregnant month, because it has the extra day. So this is a pun here, and I don't even know if it happened. But the point they're trying to say is that Rabban Gamliel didn't care if the witnesses were bad. Once he determined that it was the new moon, he wasn't going to go backwards because later testimony came in and said it wasn't. He's not going to say, well, yesterday we determined it's a 29-day month, but now we're going to determine that it was a 30-day month. That's a big deal. Like, this is astronomical truth. It's either a new moon or it's not. There's no debating that. And yet, it's dependent upon the decision of the court. And Rabban Gamliel's position, as you're going to see, is that the truth is the decision of the court, nothing else. Yeah? This is the best segue audience I've ever had. That is a perfect segue into the next line. Because Rabban Gamliel went to Rabbi Joshua, because Rabbi Joshua was like, because these other guys are nobodies, but Rabbi Joshua, that's a big shot. Rabbi Joshua was the brightest of them all. And Rabbi Joshua was like, wow, you have a good point. This Rabban Gamliel doesn't care about truth. He only cares about his own authority. So Rabban Gamliel sends to Joshua and says, I decree that you must come to me with your staff and purse on the day of Yom Kippur according to your reckoning. In other words, I said it's a 29-day month, so Yom Kippur is Tuesday. You think it was a 30-day month, so you need to come and appear before me on what you think Yom Kippur is, namely Wednesday. Now, why is that a big deal? Why does it say with your staff and purse? He's basically saying, I'm demanding that you violate Yom Kippur on the day that you think is Yom Kippur. That's a tough order. So Rabbi Akiva went and found Rabbi Joshua in distress because he was sad. He's like, oh my, what do? I either have to follow Rabban Gamliel or I have to appear before him on Yom Kippur, violating Yom Kippur, when I really think it is Yom Kippur. And eventually scientists will agree with me that that's Yom Kippur. So Akiva said to him, I have proof that everything Rabban Gamliel did is done. Namely the verse, these are the appointed times of God, the Mikra e Kodesh, which you will proclaim. In other words, the holidays of Israel are not determined by science or knowledge or the truth as it really is. It's determined by you, the court. I have no festivals. Whether they are at the right time or the wrong time. Here's even the admission. It doesn't matter if we get Yom Kippur wrong. If the court says it's Yom Kippur, it's Yom Kippur. I have no festivals besides these. Then Rabbi Joshua came to Rabbi Dosa ben Hyrcanus and said to him, if we come to debate the judgment of the court of Rabban Gamliel, then we would have to debate the judgments of every court that has ever been convened from the time of Moses until now. How do we know that? Because in that fun scene in Exodus 24, when Moses and Aaron and the others go to have a dinner party with God and they hang out with God and eat with God on the top of a mountain, yes, that is a story in Exodus 24, which is often not read. And there was God had a footstool beneath his feet that was clear as the sky, or so, however it's described. It's quite a story. Okay. Why are the names of the 70 elders not specified? It's to teach us that any court of 3 that has ever stood over Israel has held the same authority as that of Moses. If you have a court of 3, and the court of the Beis Din, if you have a Beit Din and it says something, that's the truth, regardless of whether it's true. So Rabbi Joshua took his staff and purse, and he went to Yavna to visit Rabban Gamliel on the day of Yom Kippur, according to his own reckoning. Rabban Gamliel stood and kissed him on the head. He said, "Come in peace, my master and my teacher. You are my master in wisdom." In other words, you're so much smarter than I am. But you are now also my student inasmuch as you have accepted my proclamation. So here we see, I think, a disturbing passage which says it's not just that truth is subordinated to chesed, shalom, and tzedek. Most people can get on board with that. But the notion that truth in Judaism is subordinated to the decrees of a rabbinical court, well, that's actually the opposite of what the entire Reform movement has proclaimed for 200 years, which is that things like science and tzedek and shalom actually trump the rabbinic court over the years. Yeah, Rabbi.
Into the issue about why courts are so important, both here
yes.
and in Israel.
Any other thoughts on this patch? I mean, and then I would just ask a general question. I'm not sure when I'm supposed to be done, when people leave. Like I said, I'll talk forever. 10 minutes and then there's a whole lot waiting. Oh.
Could you just review the last part a little bit? That Rabbi, the one who questioned.
Rabbi Joshua is he's the problem child.
He actually goes according to his guess. He came with his staff and money on Yom Kippur. No?
Yes, he's capitulating. He's saying, I accept that this is not Yom Kippur, which is why I'm showing up before you with money and I drove my car here, right? I'm doing that even though I think it's Yom Kippur. It's not Yom Kippur because you said it's not Yom Kippur.
So,
It is, no, absolutely.
but isn't this the...
But by the way, no one would accept, though. I mean, I don't want to use too controversial an example, but if you went to the Supreme Court and said, like, scientifically it is objectively true that such is the case, if the Supreme Court said the opposite, no one, I don't think many people in America would stand for that. Now people will say, well, what about abortion? We can prove this or that. The problem with abortion, I think, is that it's very hard to speak in any kind of way about any objective science because you're dealing with a subjective idea of life. But by and large, I think people would struggle to say we accept the Supreme Court even though we know it's wrong, which is what they're asking people to do here. Sorry, Lynn.
Well, just an observation about the calendar. I mean, this was rabbinic times when they were debating about things this way. But I think in Israel now and in liberal Judaism, we've sort of gone with the science that says we know how to determine the calendar, so we celebrate one day of Chag as opposed to the two that more traditional streams continue to observe. But somehow with all the holidays that had 2 days of celebration, they never needed 2 days for Yom Kippur.
Correct. Well, but because that was determined to be an excessive burden. And you know also the calendar is rigged so that Yom Kippur can never be on Friday or Sunday because it would be an excessive burden. What?
My father was saying every 4 years, Yom Kippur goes to Wednesday.
Yeah, but it can never be on Friday or Sunday, ever, because that would make it a burden to have Shabbat and Yom Kippur next to each other. Yom Kippur is always the 10th day of Tishrei, but the rabbis determined a way that you can control when Rosh Hashanah is, so that Rosh Hashanah is never on, what is it, Sunday and Thursday, or Sunday, Wednesday, Friday, whatever it is, so that Yom Kippur doesn't end up on the wrong way, and so that Hoshana Rabbah doesn't end up on Shabbat, but let's not worry about that. What's fascinating is that in the Orthodox world, I mean, the rigor of a candle lighting time is used with the most precise science. And yet, if you say, well, doesn't the precise science allow us to know exactly when the lunar year starts, so there's no reason to say have Yontif Sheni, 2 days of Chag, and there the argument is, well, the halacha says there's Yom Tov Sheni. Although that's cracking. In the conservative world, at least, there are cracks in the Yontif Sheni. So I want to revisit in the last couple of minutes if anybody has any insights as to the question we've posed a little bit already. My objective was to try to show you that truth is not seen as an absolute standard in Judaism, and that Jews over the years, and this is just the rabbis, but I can show you countless other times and places where Jews say that truth is a value that competes with tzedek, shalom, chesed, and others. And therefore, any kind of declaration about you should never lie, you should never do anything is not appropriate. But how do we avoid slipping all the way to the other side where we say that truth, because it is relative to other virtues, can be subordinated more often than we might like by someone saying, if I don't tell Fox viewers, or hey, let's be equal time, if I don't tell my MSNBC viewers that there's a collusion with the Russians, even though demonstrably that's false, if I don't tell them that, they might get upset and do something rash, then for the sake of shalom, do I need to do that? And how do we stake out those limits in the debate? And I told you that my colleague Wendy says that at least the first question we should ask is the deception for my own betterment and my own well-being or for someone else's? And if it's the former, then it's immediately ruled out. But if it's the latter, which it could be presented as, are there any more limits we can put on the relativization of truth? Yeah.
But even that is problematic, as is the case with the abortion drugs, that some people are saying the science makes it very clear that these are safe, and therefore, because of the chesed of the pregnant woman.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you're thinking about the status of unborn, so again, it depends on sort of what your values are going into that to start with.
Of course. And that's why, yes, that's why I think it's issues like abortion and death penalty, and I guess a new one would be, and maybe you talk about these, like trans children or something. If these were easy subjects, if the issues were cut and dry and the values were clean and easy to understand, you wouldn't have a nation divided. It's precisely because one person's conception of chesed, it might be slightly different from another person's conception of chesed and emet and so on and so forth. Which is why I don't think any discussion of this is ever going to it's not going to determine these issues. We're not going to resolve these debates. Let's do Marcy and then Scott.
So over the past maybe 10 years, I've noticed a real big divide between those people who see the world in terms of black and white. So there's an absolute truth. This is absolutely the way it is. And those people who see the world in more complex terms.
A touch of gray.
It's grayer.
As Jerry Garcia put it.
And these issues are very complex. So I think when we look for the truth, that's when it gets very difficult. And a lot of these issues don't have a truth to them. And so it's very complicated today.
Agreed. And I think in that TV show, The Good Place, without giving a spoiler or whatever it's called, I think that is one of the conclusions the show comes to, which is that the absolute moral philosophical understanding of truth is ultimately untenable.
By the way, that show was created by Mike Schur, who was a Harvard grad married to a Catholic woman, daughter of Regis Philbin. And he was in the Harvard Lampoon, but not a philosophy major. I think he was an English major.
Fascinating.
Okay, so I want to comment about this because I think we've framed this question perhaps where we are going to get to a dead end, which is I think we started by talking about the Trumpism of alternate truths. That's not what my recollection is, that's not what they said. It's alternate facts. And facts can come to you in lots of different ways, and facts aren't always 100% true. Sometimes facts are, this is what someone else's determination based on the research they did. They came to these facts at the end of their research, which arguably could be true or not true, I suppose. So I'm one that doesn't disagree with the fact that there are alternate facts. There are. We all pick the facts that we want to use to make our arguments, which is what the proof texts are all about. So I'm going to go with a maybe controversial approach, which is I think the internet has been great for this. All the facts are out there or a lot of the facts are out there for anybody to get. If you don't like my interpretation of it, then you're separating yourself out from me. That's okay. But that doesn't mean that it's bad for society that we've actually brought light or onto the facts for anybody to have access to, as opposed to having it be interpreted by a whole bunch of other people.
I think you're right, but I also think in that there has been a loss of certain grand national narratives which people mourn.
Well, that's because everybody has their own individual narrative.
Yeah, no, and a lot of those grand national narratives are probably worth ditching anyway. But it's still a sense of brokenness and loss, which I think people.
I agree with
yeah.
you. There's a sense of brokenness, but maybe people find it.
And just so people don't think this is like a brand new problem. I mean, I study, among other things, classical Greece, and you may be familiar that, 2,500 years ago, there was debate within philosophical circles between philosophers and sophists, people who would say, no, the purpose of what we're doing is actually trying to ascertain the truth about the world as it really is, versus the sophists who said, no, that's a pipe dream. The point is, how can I manipulate words and coordinate ideas in order to convince people that something is true, whether or not it actually is? And of course, sophistry has come to have a negative connotation, and lawyers are mocked all the time for being sophists, but it's a debate between two, I think, viable approaches to understanding truth and language that is not going to go away just because Wendy and I wrote this book. But it's a worthwhile conversation, I think, for communities that are religious and interested in ultimate reality and such, as people have said, to engage in. I take my cues from Michael, but the rabbi is above both of us. So.
We have time for like one more comment, and then.
Oh, it's from HUC Press. I gave out all my free copies to students. I think it's like $20. It's not expensive. What's that?
Excuse me.
Well, they're not rotten, but they are poor. So, how about one more? Because that was a
one more for sure.
Last question. You get the final word.
Okay. How do we get through our fears for what's going on, especially for the next generation?
How do we get through our fears? That's a question for a rabbi, not a professor. Well, what's scary?
The toxic environment that we're living in.
I might be the wrong person to ask that, because not because I see myself as a professor or a scholar and not as a rabbi, but more because one of the problems with being an ancient historian is that sometimes it's hard to connect to people in the modern world. But one of the advantages is perspective. And I still think, call me an optimist, that I'm the luckiest person that, during COVID, I remember telling my wife, I was like, okay, if I get COVID, there's like a 0.005 chance that I'm going to die. And I said, you know what? I was 44 at the time, whatever. It's like, if I die at age 44, I've still lived a life that is about 10,000 times better and longer than 99.9% of the population that has ever lived on planet Earth. Now, I didn't want to get COVID and die, but there's a sense, maybe in my advanced years, of an appreciation for just how remarkable the time and place that we live in right now is. And I fear, yes, of course, I'm afraid when I see, you know, the rise of white supremacism and Nazis. Okay, I've also taught a course on Holocaust. I know what white supremacism and Nazis look like in real time, and it's a far cry from what we're dealing with today. So do I have a certain amount of anxiety about what could be in 5, 10, 15 years? Maybe even 1 year. But when I look at the world, when I go through my daily life, driving on the 110, school, going to Chipotle, taking my kids to Little League games, I'm worried much more about the fact that I pass by 20 tents on the side of the road than I am that there's a couple of nuts out there that are white supremacists. But again, I may be naive. It just seems to me that in my daily life, the real predicaments that people in America are facing are the ones that are much harder to solve and much harder to point at and say bad. It's very easy to point at someone else far away who hates Jews and say bad than it is to wrestle with the fact that we live in Beverly Hills and hundreds of thousands of people live in abject poverty in our midst. Like, that's, to me, the real pressing concern. But again, tomorrow, if the Gestapo comes and arrests us all, I was wrong and I apologize.
With that, we're going to move directly into lunch. We're going to invite Rabbi Garraway. First of all, we say thank you and give him another hand. Thank you. We're going to invite Rabbi Garraway to lead our Kiddush and Motzi in the back of the room. It's right there. And then we'll move right outside for lunch. Outside? No. Outside of this room, indoors, however.